Good afternoon, and thank you for joining HireRight today for our first webinar of the year. Today, we are presenting our drug testing State of the Union for 2024. I am Ashley Kirchmar, account analyst for our drug and health screening business here at HireRight, and I will be your host today. HireRight prepared this presentation for informational purposes only and is not intended to be substituted for legal advice. Should you have any legal questions, please direct them to your legal counsel. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We will not be providing copies of the slides today. However, we will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI and term credit and a link to the recorded session that you can listen to at your own convenience or share with your colleagues. If you are experiencing any audio or visual issues, please refresh the browser window by pressing F5 on your keyboard, or let us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please be sure to take our short survey and let us know if this session was valuable and if you have any ideas for future topics. I would like to introduce HireRight's speaker for today, Dr. Todd Simo. He is HireRight's Chief Medical Officer and Managing Director of Transportation. If you'd like to view his bio, you can do so in the speaker folder at the bottom. I'd like to turn it over to him now.
Well, thank you, Ashley. And for everyone who's attending, welcome. This, quite honestly, is my favorite webinar of the year. Within this webinar, I'll be going through, several pertinent data pieces in regards to, what's happening with the industry in general, as well as what's happening specifically within the HireRight, client base, and do, some comparisons by, specimen in regards to the positivity rate, utilization, and even talk about some drug screening panel configurations, mostly in regards to, clients testing for Delta-9 THC, the substance previously known as marijuana or not. I really want to make a special, call out to some industry colleagues. So, at Quest Diagnostics. Quest Diagnostics is gracious enough every year to share their lab data. And that lab data, in regards to the size of the lab that Quest is really valuable. So again, thank you, Quest. So, what are we going to look at? Number one, we're going to look at yearly trends. So, what are the lab positive rates? How do those compare to the, so to speak, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Safety, Mental Health Safety Administration, every year, has, publishes the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. And from that perspective, they have a question on there and they break that question down into multiple data sets. So if anybody really wants to drill into the data, it is interesting. And those multiple data sets are, by what drugs people are using, when they have used it, have they used it within the past year, as they used it within the past month. The group that I use in the comparison is people in the age group of 26 and greater. So those are generally people in their employment arena that is more of their long-term job, and then compare, how often do they say they're using a, illicit drug. And in this report, marijuana, Delta-9 THC is still considered an illicit drug. So that's the rates that I'll be using for the self-reported rate. Then, lab positive rates are important, but then I'm going to drill into the HireRight data to look at the comparison between the MRO verified rates, because that's what most of you are consuming, either directly from HireRight or some other drug and health screening third-party administrator. And then we will talk about which specimen HireRight's clients are using. Everybody wants to know about marijuana trends. And if I go back a few years, every time I did a marijuana, deck, by the time I presented it, it was already, obsolete, that the laws were changing rapidly. It seems like the laws are changing less rapidly now, but this is up to date as of the beginning of this year. So we're going to look at medical marijuana, state decriminalized marijuana for recreational use, as well as the, changing landscape, by jurisdiction. So there's some jurisdictions now that I, recommend that even though you can test for Delta-9 THC, you can test for marijuana, that you really should. I'm going to provide a DOT update on alternate specimens, i.e., oral fluid and hair. Look at the return on investment of your drug screening program, based upon the HireRight data. And then as a recap, go through the 5 most important things I believe you should consider in 2024. So let's go ahead and look at the positive rates. So again, this data, once again, is from Quest Diagnostics. This is from their drug testing index that they created in about September of last year. So this is for 2022 data. And from this perspective, you can see the lab positive rates, whether it's federally mandated urine testing, which is the low water mark at 2.4%, or hair testing, which the lab positive rate at Quest was over 13%, and the ones in between. Now, oral fluid, I'm going to go through a call out for that, but Quest Diagnostics, just like HireRight, has considerable amount of clients that have stopped testing for Delta-9 THC in oral fluid. And that seems to be the specimen where the removal of THC is, from the panel has been most pronounced. And that has really truncated that oral fluid lab positive rate. However, from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, their National Survey of Drug Use and Health published in 2023, which is really for 2022 data, so it's a comparator. People over the age of 26, nearly 16% of people said they used an illicit drug within the past month. So that could be marijuana, and marijuana is the primary driver. But, around 3.5%, of the people that took that survey used an illicit drug, other than marijuana, predominantly cocaine or methamphetamine, during that period of time. So there has been a upward escalation in self-reported use year over year. That escalation is primarily in the utilization of Delta-9 THC, which makes sense. There's now a variety of states that have decriminalized it for recreational use. But along with that stepwise increase in, so to speak, marijuana use, there has also been a stepwise increase in drug use other than marijuana. So that's a concerning societal fact. So when you start looking at, this, year over year, so you look at the Quest laboratory positive rates year over year. So the urine positive data now blends both the DOT and non-DOT urine into one line. And you can see that, this has, remained around 4.5%. And in the last, few years, just over 4.5% to 4.6%. But the urine positive rate has stayed fairly flat, where you can see the self-reported rate has increased year over year. When you start looking at, I'll kind of jump oral fluid and you go to hair, you can see that hair, so to speak, keeps up to it to a certain extent. So, hair certainly has the highest lab positive rate. It has the highest, detection window. So if you are using a drug either legally or illegally that's part of that panel, as soon as you ingest it, within about a week, it appears in the hair. And depending on how long the hair is, that testing window can be as long as 90 days. And for it to be as long as 90 days, that's about 1.5 inches of hair closest to the scalp. If, a lot of males don't have that long hair, so then it's 1.5 inches from, either your scalp, your armpit. And again, the minimum sample should be at least 1/2 inch long. So again, in some, follicularly challenged, i.e. bald person, they may be looking for an alternate site such as, armpit hair. But you can see that rate has stayed high. And you can see that oral fluid up till 2021 actually was competitive with hair. So hair has that up to 90-day window, and oral fluid really has about a 2-day window for most substances and less than a 1-day window for, delta 9 THC. And from that perspective, it up until 2021, it was a very competitive with hair in regards to the lab positive rate. But what Quest saw in 2021, and that trend continued into 2022, that the overall lab positive rate, dropped. And that lab positive rate dropped based upon the clients of Quest removing delta 9 THC from the oral fluid panel. So, clients that were using oral fluid a lot of times are very high consumers of drug testing, i.e. they do a lot of testing. So it's the staffing industry, it's the retail industry, it's logistics industry. And some of those employers were making the stance based upon their risk mitigation profile of not testing for THC. And you could see the drop. And I believe over 40% of the Quest samples in 2022 in oral fluid did not have THC as part of the panel. So again, that was really the drop. It wasn't due to a sensitivity or an adulterant or something else within oral fluid. It was really due to the panel removing THC from that. So let's look at transactional volume. Now this goes to HireRight data. So, from a HireRight perspective, of our 2 million drug screens a year, I right now have a lifestyle completely predicated on urine, right? 90+% of our samples are in urine, and that trend has persisted since coming out of the pandemic. Oral fluid, there was it was higher coming out of the pandemic. It nominally lowered in 2022, and it rebounded a bit in 2023. And my thought is it's going to continue to rebound and start becoming more prevalent of a specimen. There's some laws in Washington and California that really promote oral fluid as a sample, because oral fluid does look for psychoactive component of delta 9 THC, because it looks for delta 9 THC itself. So, if you want to preserve your right to test for marijuana in Washington or California, using oral fluid would be your specimen of choice. DOT is in the process has approved it, and we're just waiting for some labs. And the collection site networks are really going to respond. Their Laboratory Corporation of America has actually set up their patient service centers in Washington and California to collect oral fluid. I believe Quest Diagnostics is on that process, and other clinic vendor networks are also looking at it. But once, the DOT volume can, so to speak, that DOT volume can start using, oral fluid because there's 2 approved labs, I really believe the nationwide collection network for oral fluid will mushroom and give you you the ability to use, oral fluid at the clinic, because today the vast majority of our volume, and I can say nearly 100% of our oral fluid volume, is collected by, clients collecting on their own candidates and employees. And the thing that I have noticed since, the pandemic is many of our, large consumers of hair testing have stopped testing for hair. Hair, has one advantage, or has many advantages, but one advantage that it had is it had a high donor fear factor. When you published on your website that you did hair testing, the amount of applications that you got in went down. And it's because people, the deterrence effect of hair is high due to the long, so to speak, detection window. Well, coming out of the pandemic and with the labor shortages, many of our clients said, hey, we need to move away from hair. We need those applicants to come in. So we're going to look at other specimens. and almost to a person, they transition that volume into urine. But that's really our transactional volume by percentage year over year. When you start looking at, percentage clients that have, a given account, so that's not going to add up to 100%, because some clients have a urine account and an oral fluid account. And in fact, nearly all of our large, consumers of oral fluid tests actually have a urine account with that as well. And the reason for that is many of them are in the manufacturing space, and they have legacy, so to speak, collective bargaining agreements with their unions, and that collective bargaining agreement hasn't been renegotiated to allow the company to use oral fluid. So, nearly all of the oral fluid clients have a urine account. Then we have about 2% of our clients actually having an oral fluid count. And again, nearly the same amount have a hair account, but what we are seeing is the utilization of hair going down. And that was really driven by some very large hair consumers switching over to urine. And, from a transactional volume perspective, once again, 94%, is in, 94.3% is in urine, and I'm not going to read the numbers. Oral fluid is the second most common, hair is the least common, and it's far lower than even hair, even oral fluid itself. So now that we talked about, specimen utilization, let's start driving into, MRO verified positive rates. So in this given data, from a urine perspective, that does blend both our Department of Transportation, DOT, as well as our non-DOT. So all the urine tests are put in a blender, and after you do the blending and say, hey, what has come out as being MRO verified positive, you can see for the 4 years prior, it was just in the 2.3% range, exceptionally flat. We did see a increase, and a sizable increase, relatively speaking, in the MRO verified rate in 2023, in urine. So urine's now up over 2.5%. But you can see that even though it's up, when you compare it to the other specimens, you can see that the MRO verified rate is, less than half of that of oral fluid or hair. So again, those are, so 2.6% of our urine volume was MRO verified positive, 5.7% of our oral fluid volume was MRO positive, and 5.7% of our hair testing was MRO positive. And when you all of a sudden say, hey, wait a minute, Todd, oral fluid, hair had a much higher positive rate from a lab level than, oral fluid did. How can they have the same MRO verified positive rate? The answer to that is hair detects drug use, and within all the drug panels are some prescription medications, such as codeine, morphine, hydrocodone. Those come back positive from the lab to the MRO team. The MRO team then interviews the donor. If the donor has a legitimate, verifiable, legal, medical explanation for a result, so they're positive for codeine on their hair test, but they had a prescription for codeine 6 weeks ago, due to bronchitis, well, we're able to use that, information, make that drug screen negative. So yes, it does have a much higher lab positive rate, but it also has the highest rate of us converting a laboratory positive test to an MRO verified negative test. So again, from this perspective, I'm glad the marketing team said that we should use aqua and blue, but now I really teased out the urine volume. I took hair off of there since hair is a rounding error to the other two predominant specimens. But you can see that there was an increase in the MRO verified positive rate, both in non-regulated testing as well as in, DOT testing. And so to speak, the percent increase is fairly equivalent. DOT is, of course, less, half of that of non-reg, but they both had an increase in regards to the MRO verified positive rate year over year. Hair is essentially stayed flat. Oral fluid has essentially stayed flat. That oral fluid has sat over the 5.5% in both instances. And again, the small decrease is really nominal there from a percentage of overall. So, and here's the MRO verified positive rate trend on all non-regulated specimens. So again, it's putting the non-regulated urine, the oral fluid, and the hair in a blender by month, or by quarter, and going out for the last 2022 to 2023. So you can see that there was a upward trend throughout 2022, and then it flattened out and went down over 2023. So again, that's just the MRO verified positive rate. And again, the good news is it isn't continuing to go up and up and up and up. We may have hit the high water mark as more and more clients remove THC from the panel due to their risk mitigation strategy. It may continue to go down nominally, but I believe it'll stay around that 3.5 range throughout 3% range, throughout 2024. But of special note, I didn't track this in 2022, but I'm starting to track it started to track it in 2023, and will continue to track it in 2024. And this was really based on me meeting some of our largest, drug screening clients. And what I saw over the years, many of those clients had a much higher, so to speak, refusal to test rate than what they did in the past. That there was a new adulterant to the market at the end of Q3, that we had an enormous spike in the amount of what we call substituted specimens. That there was something out there that was in all likelihood promoted as synthetic urine that the manufacturer didn't make right, and there was a lot more substituted specimen than we've ever seen before. Overall, from a percentage, it's a 0.1 increase over the first 2 quarters. But again, over 2 million drug screens and at a single client level, that it is fairly exceptional. And I'm going to continue to watch this, because what I see, what I saw in a client that I met this week is, from a pre-employment perspective, they don't look for Delta-9 THC. Their overall positive rate was low. However, their refusal to test rate was actually about equivalent to their positive rate. So there were people that were going to the collection site, giving cold urine, when asked to resubmit a urine sample, left the collection site, and had a refusal to test. So there was a certain amount of gamesmanship that's still happening at the donor level that results in refusal to test. And even with the truncated panel, we're seeing that as being more significant than actually the MRO, or as significant as the MRO positive rate. And in post-hire, this given client's actual non-regulated positive rate that include THC was less than their pre-employment derogatory rate. So it was just one of those things that, I've used this statistic all the time, and feel free to cite me on it. 10 out of 10 people using an illicit drug know it. So, and therefore, if they have an opportunity to study for a test, they're certainly going to take that opportunity. And that in my mind is the reason that the urine positive rate is not markedly going up year over year like the self-reported drug use rate, because people who are using, know they are using, will potentially avoid employment that requires a drug test. And if employment does require a drug test, that they're able to do a urine test, they are able to, so to speak, prep for it and study for it. So, I have traditionally left off alcohol data here, but I certainly wanted to, put this in there. So from a DOT positive rate perspective, you can see that that rate is about, you know, 0.33% or a third of a percent of all of the alcohol tests that we do, are, not negative. So they're positive or they're canceled for whatever reason, or it's a refusal to test. So again, that rate is, exceptionally small. And in fact, it's not a third, it's a fourth of a percent end up, in that, non-negative range, being driven by a positive. And nearly all of those positives in the DOT arena are reasonable suspicion. So that's the good news for our transportation employers, that their positives aren't happening post-accident. They're happening when, the DOT employer has a reason to compel a test based upon reasonable suspicion. Now, non-regulated, on the other hand, you can see, the numbers are considerably higher. Now you're looking at, over 2%, approaching 3% of those tests are positive. And again, there's less kind of routine testing in the non-regulated arena. So unlike DOT, which has, a burden of 10% of a regulated employee population based upon the industry has to be tested in a random perspective, most non-regulated employers, so to speak, non-DOT employers, testing under, their policy, don't do that type of random testing. And where we see the positive rate in the non-regulated alcohol are almost almost all post-accident. So there's some incident, there's some trigger event that says, hey, I need to test this person because they had an accident at work, they hurt someone else, they damaged property. Pursuant to our policy, we have a trigger to mandate testing. And that's where we're seeing those positives, is really after an accident or incident. So again, DOT, it's happening reasonable suspicion. Non-DOT, it's happening for a for-cause test. You have a trigger event, but that trigger event tends to be an accident and not reasonable suspicion. And that really, when you start looking at it, emphasizes the need, to have a reasonable suspicion program, so to speak, train on that reasonable suspicion program, make it as easy to use as possible so managers and supervisors can engage it in as easy a manner as they can. So now one of our favorite topics, Delta-9 THC, the substance otherwise known as marijuana, and screening programs. So let's just look at Delta-9 THC, first, and the impairment, it causes. So when people all of a sudden go, marijuana and alcohol, they're both here, legal in this state, and they're like the same thing. That really is a statement that is false. The reason for that is alcohol, is impairing based upon a blood alcohol level. When you achieve a certain blood alcohol level, you have achieved a certain degree of impairment. As that blood alcohol level goes down, the actual impairment from alcohol goes down. And once it's at 0, 0, 0, you're no longer, so to speak, impaired by alcohol. Now, you may have an impairing event based upon lack of sleep because you were up throwing up all night or due to some sort of hangover, but the substance itself is no longer impairing. The alcohol itself is no longer impairing. However, from a Delta-9 THC perspective, so, traditional marijuana, you go ahead and smoke it, you all of a sudden feel high for, several hours, up to 6 hours. And really the 6 hour mark is more of the edibles where you have a delayed, so to speak, absorption of the THC. But from that perspective, you feel high for 3 to 6 hours. So, that's the typical, feeling high, you're a little euphoric, you have impaired perception, you may be sleepy, you can be relaxed, And when people are intoxicated by THC, they actually do things that, protect themselves. So, and when I say protect themselves, I'll use driving behavior. People who, are in a driving simulator that have smoked marijuana typically go slower than what they're supposed to drive at, and typically slow down at intersections, even if they don't have to stop. So they're slowing down at green lights. They're sometimes stopping at green lights. They're sometimes have exceptionally long following distances. So, or there are people that stop at a stoplight and there's 5 car lengths in front of them when they stop. And the reason is the person is aware that they're having problems spatially discriminating. They're aware that they can't respond as quickly. So there's something about the immediate effect of THC on the brain that makes the person aware of that impairment. However, as that wears away, the THC is still in the brain. It may not even be in the blood anymore, but it's still in the brain and it's still impairing. So there's multiple occupational health literature coming out, and it's really been coming out since the second term of the Obama administration, where decriminalized marijuana, you didn't have to have a medical card, that you could buy it in Colorado, that so to speak, some studies could happen. Traditionally, those studies on marijuana all happened in Amsterdam. But now, we can start looking at use in the United States. And from that perspective, a lot of occupational health literature has come out showing the impairment window after single use of, many times it's a low-grade THC product. We're talking subs 5% delta-9 THC in the product, will impair people beyond the point where they think they're impaired. And the activities that are most profoundly impaired at the 24 and 36-hour mark are what I have, listed here. Complex skills and tasks. So the ability to do something that requires multiple steps. Discerning spatial relationships, i.e. your depth perception, is off. Multiple task tracking is a term used for noticing things in your peripheral vision. So you may be looking centrally at the car bumper in front of you, but you can notice the little girl chasing after a ball in your peripheral vision. People that used marijuana the night before don't do that as well. And the last is quick decision making. And again, all of those, those above tasks that are almost equally impaired at 36 hours than when the person was feeling high, impact safety sensitive labor, such as driving, many duties within a manufacturing facility, duties within patient care. I certainly, don't want a nurse or phlebotomist, being, still impaired by their use of marijuana the night before, because all of those things that I just list, from complex skills and discerning spatial relationship and quick decision making, are all very important in patient care. So, a little talk on, cannabidiol, so CBD. Again, CBD is, the part of the cannabis plant. CBD in the naturally occurring plant that hasn't been hybrid to be high, high THC, tends to have a level less than the THC, but kind of pretty close to equivalent of it. In the higher grade products and the hybrid strains that are starting to give you very high percentages of THC, the CBD is driven down markedly. Now, CBD is the part of the marijuana plant that has the anti-epileptic effect. So it is the part that if you have a child with seizures, CBD does work to, so to speak, treat those seizures. It was originally thought that CBD was, useful for pain, both neuropathic and inflammatory. But there's been emerging studies that really show that CBD by itself has no effect on pain. And in fact, there was a study published earlier in 2023 that was a double-blind study that showed that pure CBD had no different effect on a person than a placebo. So really, it seems that the medical community believes that for it to have appropriate pain relief, there has to be kind of an equivalent level of THC and CBD in that product. That certainly high dose THC products don't treat pain, but also pure CBD products don't treat pain. And again, CBD, there is a FDA approved Schedule 5 drug called Epidiolex that is pure CBD. So the next thing is the CBD, an approved medication by the FDA. And the rule is no, unless it's Epidiolex, unless it's the pharmaceutical grade CBD. Everything that you buy over the counter is not a medication or a medical supplement, and that's explicit by FDA rules. So again, there's a quote here from the FDA that the FDA is aware that some companies are marketing products containing cannabis and cannabis-derived compounds in a way that violates the FDA rule and may put health and safety of consumers at risk. There's emerging evidence that CBD has more liver toxicity than most medications. So again, from this perspective, all over-the-counter CBD products are not a medication, and they aren't approved for any kind of medical purposes. So therefore, CBD is not a medical explanation for a Delta-9 THC positive laboratory result. So cannabis in the workplace, anybody who joins my colleague Alonzo on any of his update webinars often gets, sees this slide. And the real part of this slide is I'm not going to run through from a state by state perspective, but, from a medical perspective, if I go back to 2009, there was not one state that you had to accommodate medical marijuana use. There were no recreational states. It was in 2010 where Arizona, when they passed their medical marijuana statute, had a caveat that said, you can't automatically take derogatory employment action on a person who is a medical marijuana user unless you have a compelling business reason to do so, such as, they're the overhead crane operator in the ammunition plant, which is an exceptionally safety sensitive job. But that same person may be able to be the receptionist at the ammunition plant or some other white collar position at the ammunition plant. So again, originally everything was in the red category. So all the states that had a medical marijuana statute were in the red category. Arizona was the first one to fall in that kind of green category. There are states that continue to remain silent in this regard. And again, there has been, one jurisdiction, Philadelphia, that just says for pre-employment testing, you can't test for marijuana unless you meet one of the several carve-outs that they allow pursuant to Philadelphia statute. Now that's just the medical cannabis. It then gets confusing again when you go recreational cannabis, because you have two states now, Minnesota, where I grew up, and New York, where my wife grew up, that kind of prohibit pre-employment marijuana testing. In fact, New York prohibits marijuana testing, and largely Minnesota does as well, unless you have reasonable suspicion. So unless you have reasonable suspicion, you can't test for Delta-9 THC in New York. And reasonable suspicion in New York is not body odor or, itself. So if you smell marijuana on someone in New York as an employer, but you have no other articulable observations, such as, red eyes or, impaired gait or, erratic behavior or lethargy. If it just says body odor, that it doesn't meet the criteria for reasonable suspicion in New York. Now, again, there's now emergence starting at the very beginning of this year, 1/1/2024, that, from a pre-employment perspective in Washington, you can't, test for THC. Post-employment, if they're exceptionally safety sensitive, you may be able to test for THC in the non-psychoactive form. But in Washington and California, you largely have to look for the psychoactive form of THC. And the psychoactive form of THC is, the three predominant specimens: urine, oral fluid, and hair. Urine and hair look for a metabolite of THC that is not psychoactive. Oral fluid actually looks for delta-9 THC in its parent form and its unchanged form by the body. Therefore, it is the psychoactive component. So to preserve your right in the non-DOT company policy perspective, if you want to test for THC in marijuana, or California or Washington, you need to switch to oral fluid. Again, you see that there's 4 tests that permit you to test, but you may not be able to take action on that positive. And again, 17 don't offer any sort of protection for the recreational user. Even though the state says they can legally use, there's no protection in those states. So this is really my recommendation, and I actually spoke at the Littler-Mendelson Executive HR Conference in Arizona, so I really want to thank them for inviting me to speak to their client base. And this was really vetted with the attorneys there, and it fell into 2 categories at the time, and we did talk about California and Washington. So the 4 jurisdictions, or I guess 5 jurisdictions, 4 state and 1 city, that I say remove THC from your panel is really New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Minnesota, as well as Philadelphia, as we talked about before. New York's the only one that says thou shalt not test for THC. I guess New York and Minnesota broadly have that language. But New Jersey says you can test for it, you just can't take action against it. And again, you rather not know than know and not be able to take action on it. Because if someone, who's running the overhead, crane in the ammunition plant drops something and blows up the plant, and she kills 3 of her coworkers, you're going to get 4 families suing you. The 3 coworkers' family, as well as the person, Sally, who was running the crane. And the reason for that is Sally's family is going to go, well, you knew Sally used marijuana and you let her up in a dangerous environment and she killed herself. So now now we're holding you responsible. So again, that's why I say in those jurisdictions, even if you can, don't. I say consider removing THC. Nevada pre-employment, there's some language there in their statute, that will say you probably shouldn't do it unless you have an exceptionally safety sensitive position. Kind of the same in Montana as well as in Washington. And again, as we talked about before, psychoactive THC, it should only be used in California and Washington. And again, in the states any of the states that you have reasonable suspicion, you can test for THC. Again, in California, you have to test for the psychoactive component. In Washington, I recommend you using oral fluid because they'll all of a sudden say, hey, is this job so safety sensitive, i.e., does this job cause potential death? Trying to defend that with a plaintiff attorney can be difficult. If you use oral fluid, you don't have to, so to speak, make that case. So it's just a cleaner product or a cleaner specimen. THC testing, the Todd Simo algorithm. Pretty easy. Is THC testing allowed? No, remove it. And this is again for urine and hair, and that's New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, Rhode Island. So just remove it. Is it a safety sensitive position? Yes, include it. If you can defend that it's a safety sensitive position, include it in your panel. If it's not a safety sensitive position, I kind of recommend or consider recommending removing it in Montana, Nevada, and Washington, D.C. So again, that's for urine and hair. Again, in oral fluid, since oral fluid's detection window for a sporadic user in oral fluids around 15 to 16 hours, and for the chronic daily user, once they stop using it, the data shows they'll clear it within 24 hours. And as I described before, the impairment window of THC is well over 24 hours. So my recommendation, if you are using oral fluid, is to continue to test for it in the panel. If, again, that's up to your risk mitigation strategy. But if I make a broad recommendation to every employer on the call, if you are using oral fluid, keep it in the panel, because if someone's coming into their job interview and having to smoke pot the night before or the morning of, again, having it in the panel and and addressing it can potentially eliminate headaches further down the road after an accident. And again, but there are the 4 jurisdictions where I just say, don't test for it, no matter what your specimen you're using, in that, unless it is for reasonable suspicion. So the THC, panel trends by HireRight clients. So you can see that, clients that have removed THC from their panel on all non-regulated tests. So I take out the DOT volume because the DOT volume is going to dilute that, right? Because DOT has to have THC in it. You can see that the percentage of clients has gone up to just over 10%, but flattened out over 2023. And the percentage of tests went up after the pandemic and kind of leveled out in that 12% range over 2023. So that's all non-regulated tests. That's both oral that's both urine and oral fluid, as well as hair. Now, if I look at it just pulling out the oral fluid, you can see that 1/3 of our volume is without THC. And 1/3 of our volume without THC has an MRO verified positive rate still of 3.1%. So it's essentially equivalent or a bit higher than actually the urine positive rate that includes THC. Now, 2/3 of our oral fluid samples continue to have THC in them. And you can see if I called them out independently, that is the group with the highest MRO verified positive rate. That number is largely driven, as you can tell, by THC. But again, I can make a case as a as a professional and as an industry expert to say the person was actually impaired with THC at the time of collection based upon the data, impairment data on THC. So when you look at urine positive, again, if it's with THC, which is 86%, you can see that it's 3.3%. If it's without THC, it's 0.4%. And as I said before, the refusal to test rate is essentially the same or higher in this category. So DOT update. So I already alluded that DOT has approved oral fluid as a specimen as of June 1st of last year. This was a specimen that SAM showed, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration had approved, back in 2020. They've wanted to have a rule on oral fluid since 2012 and finally said, yeah, we can, federal government can do it. DOT said now, 3 years later, yeah, DOT can do it. The problem here is we don't have any labs that are accredited at this point. And at a conference I was at towards the end of last year, the lab directors were really saying Q3 or Q4 this year that the labs will be accredited. So we're still in a waiting game. There may be a lab that tries to get out of the gate faster. But again, if someone asks me at this point, hey, when do you think there'll be labs approved to do DOT testing for oral fluid, I'm going to be saying it's more in the Q3, Q4 timeframe of this year. What we know about oral fluid is, oral fluid can be used on all DOT tests, once there's the labs, and the company determines what test is to be done, except for one caveat. If a transgender non-binary donor needs to have an observed specimen collection, that collection needs to be done with oral fluid. So that's part of the rule now. So therefore, every DOT client on this call, you need to start figuring out how you are going to support that caveat within the regulation. Because if, again, a transgender person that all of a sudden has a cold specimen cold urine specimen needs that, so to speak, observed specimen, you need to get a mechanism for that collector to be able to do an oral fluid test. Or you get a, so to speak, MRO verified result that says, hey, test canceled due to invalid result, an immediate rescreen with observation is required, and that person is non-binary. Again, that recollection needs to be done in oral fluid. What we don't know is what is the collector training going to entail to do an oral fluid collection. We still have testing industry unknown saying, will the collection site network increase, and what will the cost of that be? My sense is the cost of collection is not going to go down, even though it's oral fluid, and may go up. I do believe the collection site industry is going to respond, and there will be widespread collection sites that can collect oral fluid. And the next are just your normal industry roadblocks. What will your unions think? Are you willing to train collectors? And again, what is your policy considerations? Hair testing, to make it very simple, even though there's always noise about, hey, we want to get hairs, particularly coming out of the trucking industry. There is still no news from HHS on anything to allow hair testing in the federal space. Return on investment. So just so, and I know we're getting close to time here, but return on investment here is, and many of you have heard this before, every time you identify a drug or alcohol user that someone and you remove them from employment, either through termination or rehabilitation, you're saving your organization $14,000 a year. The reason it's that $14,000 a year mark is the Obama administration in its first term did a great deal of analysis on this. There's an economic impact from productivity alone that impacts employers to the tune of $81 billion. When you start putting in workman comp costs, brand and reputation costs, medical insurance costs, that number goes up over 190 billion. And the National Institute of Drug Addiction says people, addicted to drugs or alcohol, there's around 14 million of them a year that are employed. So it's a really easy math with a lot of numbers, but that number comes out to be $14,000 a year. But again, that's now data that's, over 12 years old. So that return on investment is likely higher, but at least it's a good data point. When you go through this, you can see that the specimen with the highest return on investment is actually oral fluid with THC in it. You can see second to that is hair. And then you can see oral fluid without THC and urine with THC almost have the equivalent return on investment. So this is something to consider. Now, non-regulated urine without THC, there's still a return on investment. However, that return on investment, as you can see, is far lower than all the other specimens and panel configurations. So here's the five most important things to consider. And these are probably the same actually year over year, at least the same year over year since the pandemic. And number one is they have a well-defined THC policy, because THC is impairing, and it's impairing far longer than a person feels intoxicated from it. And that impairment, does put your job site at risk for accident or injury, particularly in the safety sensitive space. Again, unfortunately, THC has wide acceptance, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, that's really up to each person. But there is, evidence that the proliferation, that there is a proliferation of decriminalized THC at the state level, with Ohio joining the mix here recently. Know your risk tolerance. So you may have positions that you want to test for THC pre-employment, and you may have positions that you don't want to. If it's defined in your policy who gets it and who doesn't, and it's non, so to speak, arbitrary, that you have a well-defined, that everybody in this job description is tested for THC, everybody in this job description isn't, again, that is a supportable program. And again, you may want to screen your safety sensitive population in a different way than your non-safety sensitive population. So the next is have an explicit, over-the-counter cannabis, policy. So when I talk about over-the-counter cannabis, the number one thing I hear all the time is CBD, right? But now, I'm in North Carolina, and in the little downtown, near Charlotte where I'm at, there's actually a shop that sells Delta 8 THC, and they promote their shop with a pot leaf out in front of it. So no, it's not Delta 9 THC. North Carolina has no Delta 9 THC rule from a medical or recreational perspective. But, they are, this shop is promoting over-the-counter cannabis, in terms of Delta 8 and CBD. Again, so you need to have a policy on this, because I've been, asked for clients to testify, and their donors are like, well, I got positive just because I use CBD. And again, CBD in the pure form does not metabolite, nor does it show up as Delta 9 THC in any form on laboratory confirmation testing. So it just doesn't happen. However, these over-the-counter cannabis products, no one is regulating how they make it. And therefore, I saw one study where people were using over-the-counter CBD products and actually achieving a level in their urine that was higher than 15 nanograms per milliliter. They weren't using any other product other than that over-the-counter CBD product. The label on the over-the-counter CBD product says contains less than 0.3% THC. However, when the researchers studied how much THC was in the product, it was 4% THC. So again, it didn't conform to its package labeling. It was essentially a marijuana product that, if I go back to when I was growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, that this was the good stuff. 4% THC was the good stuff, 4 to 5%. So these over-the-counter CBD products may be the good stuff from back in the day. And guess what? How it affects our brain doesn't matter if the intent was, well, I just want to use CBD for my pain relief. If that product has a significant amount of THC that's going to cause a so to speak, drug test to be positive, that person was having the effects of THC and the effects of being high, because that 4 or 5% in that product, our brain doesn't go, oh, that came from CBD that they were using, as sublingual drops, and therefore I'm not going to feel high. Person's actually feeling high. They may not want to admit it or acknowledge it, but how THC works, it's based upon a concentration and then a concentration in the brain. And again, CBD, since it is not a medication, it is not a medical substance, isn't a verifiable medical explanation for a positive Delta 9 THC result. So, again, in the times I've had to testify, one thing that is always brought up that I'm privy to is, well, did the company have a policy on, using over-the-counter cannabis products? My answer is, I don't know what the client's policy is. Well, what if they didn't have it? So again, if you have a policy, you can save yourselves a lot of heartburn at employment commissions. Reasonable suspicion training. And again, I referenced this earlier. The self-reported drug use rate continues to increase. You look at you look at the positive rate in alcohol, all being post-accident. In all likelihood, that wasn't the first time the person appeared at work, drunk. So therefore, having a well-defined policy that mentions your mechanism to get that testing, has well-defined what I call trigger events. So those, contemporaneous articulable observations of impairment, such as behaviors, appearance, speech, or body odor. So all of those things, and having a worksheet and routinely training supervisors and managers on, here's how we do reasonable suspicion. If you believe someone's impaired at work due to drugs or alcohol, this is how you go about doing it. Again, that is a recommendation based upon the data that is exceptionally important. The next is, consider alternate specimens where permitted. I mean, there's one state, and that's, so to speak, Vermont, that doesn't allow oral fluid tests. It's really a urine test state. But, oral fluid, I believe at this point in time, due to the detection window, and what you're doing is detecting, people that are using drugs essentially on a daily basis. Those are the people that put your job site at most risk. It has a very robust, positive rate, particularly when you add, keep THC in the panel. So again, huge return on investment, great risk mitigation value. You're detecting people that are putting your job site at imminent risk, and especially from a safety sensitive labor perspective. So I'd recommend everybody who has safety sensitive employees on this call, and I do include healthcare in the safety sensitive employee perspective, should really consider, having an oral fluid program. The next is hair. And now hair, as I said, has never been a huge specimen here at HireRight, but it's even less so now. It's really a rounding error to our other two specimens. But arguably it's the best pre-employment sample. It has a very long detection window, and it detects lifestyle drug use. So people that are, people who are sporadically using marijuana do not pop positive on a hair test. Those people are more the chronic daily user that has enough marijuana in their system to force the THC metabolite into the hair. It does detect, cocaine and methamphetamine use exquisitely within the detection period. And those, what people call hard drugs, are of concern to employers. It has a higher MRO verified rate than urine. It has a outstanding risk mitigation value. Donors that are using drugs fear that specimen because they believe they will be detected, and they really can't study for the test. But the utilization has dropped since the pandemic. Number one, due to a poor candidate experience. A lot of candidates complain that I don't like my hair cut. So that, does get back to recruiters and HR professionals. The next one is that it does have that high donor fear factor. And if you get less applications in an environment with a tight labor pool, again, that may not be the greatest specimen for you. So consider point of collection testing. That's getting immediate negative results. So we have seen clients that have moved in this direction. And what they're trying to do is there's an FDA approved, a screening device that is either an oral fluid or urine, that the person provides a sample, and within 10 minutes, if, John Donor is negative. If that test shows up that John Donor is positive in either oral fluid or urine, that specimen should be sent to the laboratory for confirmation testing, because everything you read on the internet about false positives have to relate to the testing that is part of that quick test. Because that test is really designed to say, can I say with 100% assurity this person is negative? That's what that initial test does. That's what the point of collection test does. However, if that point of collection test is not negative, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to confirm positive at the laboratory. Because if you use enough Sudafed, those point of collection devices will say you're positive for methamphetamine. There's a class of depression medicine that cause PCP positives in those devices. Well, those people certainly aren't using drugs, but that device is just there to say it's a potential. And there's now evolution, particularly in the oral fluid space, to have a, so to speak, a laboratory supported reader. So your personnel at the site does not need to read the device. There's an electronic chain of custody associated with the oral fluid device. You can read that. It goes through a laboratory electronic management system, which allows it to be used more widely in states like, or able to be used in New York, Kansas, Minnesota, and potentially Nevada. So there's a wider exception of these. And again, point of collection testing, your ability to say yes first, a lot of times in a tight labor market allows you to so to speak, get that candidate before competition does. So Ashley, I'm going to turn this over to you. I know I ran actually overtime here, so I do apologize. Any questions submitted, I will work with our team to get those answers out to you by the end of next week. And Ashley, if you want to just give closing comments.
Yeah, we just want to thank everybody for attending today's presentation. I did see a question there asking about the HRCI and SHRM credits. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with those credits. And please don't forget to take our short survey. And we are glad that you joined us today. Have a wonderful day, everyone.